Thank you for joining us again. We intend to do these about once a month on different aspects of the school curriculum so that we can give you an opportunity to learn a little bit more about it and ask us questions. So the first thing I wanted to say about today's topic, history, is that I often tell people that this school was born of resentment for my own education. And one of my main resentments is that I graduated from college knowing virtually nothing about history. I even passed the AP European History exam in high school, and still, when I graduated, knew absolutely nothing about history. I've always felt like I could be one of those people that Jay Leno stops on the street and humiliates. And I saw some heads nodding in the audience, so I suspect I would not be alone in that feeling. And I had a couple of experiences that really drove home to me how little I knew about history. One was that I was in a conversation with someone about the concept of slavery. And in discussion of this concept, he said, well, give me examples of slavery throughout history. And I went, slavery in the United States. That was literally the only example I could come up with. I bet these guys could rattle off quite a few more. So that was alarming to me and to the person I was talking to. Another time, I was thinking about something to do with the Catholic and Protestant churches, and the question occurred to me, how did that split happen again? What exactly was the historical situation? And I was in the car with my grandmother, and she was a librarian and an English teacher and a gardener. And I turned to her and I said, tell me the story of the Protestant and Catholic churches, and knew without a doubt that she would be able to rattle off the whole story to me in essentials, and simply because she had a better education than I did. So when I started homeschooling, my goal was to help ensure that the kids didn't feel like that when they graduated. And my way of doing it at the time was just to get textbooks from the early 20th century, and they were told it really as stories. And that was part of the key I found, was that they were retainable and intelligible because they were told still as stories, unlike the textbooks for social studies class that I had become accustomed to, that were boring and fragmented. And the way textbooks are made, a lot of material just gets forced in, sort of crammed into them, and so there's no single intelligent sequence to the presentation. So that was the idea. One final thing I want to say before I turn it over to the actual history teachers is in conversations about, well, two things. In conversations about the world today, about political concepts, and in schools today where they're advocating for activism in the kids, for encouraging them to hold strong opinions and to take a stand on issues and to be passionate and involved in politics. My concern is, my shorthand way of capturing it is, that the attitude is, it's all here, and now we just have to form opinions about it, with no understanding of how we got here and what's at stake in the issues that people are discussing with the perspective and context of history. And that's deeply concerning to me. And it's something that became more concerning the more history I started to learn, because I do believe that if people don't understand where government came from and where law came from and where democracy came from, and understand what happens when those do not exist, they're not going to have the ability to help us safeguard and protect those fundamental things that make life as we know it possible. So that is a big part of our goal with the history curriculum. Now, each of the teachers is going to speak a little bit to the specifics, some other ideas and specifics of their teaching at their history level at the school.
So I'll go first, I guess. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out here. I'm kind of an odd duck. I really like being grilled by people about what I do and what I teach. Like I like to talk about this and answer as many questions as I can. And I've actually gained quite a lot from parent questions over the years. It helps me to think critically about what I'm doing and to improve as a teacher. And so when Lisa asked me to have a few remarks, I thought of like what are the biggest questions parents have asked me over the years that have been most valuable to me, and I thought I'd share that and the kinds of answers that I've come up with. And I just have two questions that I've gotten over the years. One is, what's the point of any particular fact of history? You know, why do they need to know that the Charter of Liberties was written in 1100 by Henry I? Unless they're on Jeopardy, what's the point of that particular piece of information? And there's a lot of standard answers that history teachers give to this sort of thing. You know, the classic one, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. Or as Miss VanDamme was alluding to, that in order to better understand the world that's around us, we need to know where things came from. We can't just take for granted that the way that we live today, the world that we live in today, is the way that people have always lived and it will always be here. Unless we understand the underpinnings of the society that we're in, we're kind of victims of tides beyond our control. But another answer to this question, why do we learn any particular fact, that I've been thinking about a lot recently and that I get a lot of joy from, or it's very motivating for me as a teacher, and I use this as a motivation for the students. It occurred to me that humans are naturally historical creatures. We look at the world in a historical fashion. So if you're going to buy a house or a car, you want to know the history of that object. You want to know the nature of the owners and the way it's been treated. So you'll have greater control and understanding of that purchase if you know its history. Or if you're going out on a date for a first date, you want to try to assess as politely as possible the history of the person you're on the date with, because you'll have a better sense of the world that you're in. You can navigate better when you know that. Or if your child comes home and they're very sad, you want to know the history of that sadness. You want to know, where did it come from? What was its causes? So we think historically all day, every day. Whenever we see things that we care about or problems in our environment, we want to know the history of that problem. And so the reason that we teach history as one of the benefits, and there's many benefits to history, but one of the benefits is it trains us to be better historical thinkers. It trains us to understand that the things that are around us have a history. They didn't just spring out of nowhere. They came from somewhere. So that's one thing that I've gained from these parent conversations. And when I say this to students, that you guys are already amateur historians, you already think like historians in your day-to-day life, it's very motivating for them to realize that I'm training them in a skill they already practice. Another question that I get a lot from parents, mostly in tours of the school, it's a question that's something along the lines of, what kind of history do you teach? And usually what they're asking is, like, what spin do we come from? You know, are we pro-American? Are we Marxist? Are we Christian? Are we left, right, center, etc.? And when I first would get those questions, I'd get very uncomfortable and scared that I would say the wrong thing. Because I don't go into the classroom thinking like I'm going to spread one kind of a truth or another. I like to think I'm presenting the facts as objectively as any human being can. But, you know, there's no intended bias. There's no spin I'm putting on things. But it is natural, you know, I'm a person that has values, and I'm going to select items of history that I think are most valuable. So my classes will have the imprint of Mr. Steele. And as parents have asked me, what do you do about this? I've always been thinking, how can I make sure that I'm giving the fairest representation of everything I can in the classroom? And the way that I do that is, I always, one of the things that the students hear me say a lot, and I don't mean this in a joking way, this made sense to people at the time. So whether I'm talking about the practices Spartans had for raising their boys to be warriors. And the children are like, this is horrifying, this is crazy, I can't believe they did this. Or whether we're talking about the Salem witch trials and the kids are like, what is going on here? What is going wrong with these girls? I always drive home to them that this made sense to the people who did it. And they are the same species as you. They have the same brains that you do, give or take. They have the same capacity for thought and feeling that you do. And so our job as historians is not to Twitter and laugh at how bizarre things were in the past, but to say, what is the best argument we can make for why people did what they did? We can only really understand the past if we give every figure that we study in history the best presentation possible. So later this year, I'm going to be teaching them about Louis XIV, the Sun King, and he's an odd duck. And the kids are going to be like, this is crazy. I cannot believe what is happening in Versailles. This is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. And it's become, I love it when I hear the kids giggle, because I know I'm going to have a good lesson. If they're giggling, that means I get to try to help them understand why it made sense for the figures of history to do what they did. This is not to be an apologist for the crazy and horrifying things that have happened in history, but if we're going to best avoid the horrifying things of history, we need to be able to understand it even in the terms of the people that committed those acts. So when I get to Louis XIV, I'm going to talk to them. He thought that the nobles were going to rip the French Empire apart. He thought that if he did not wrest control in the craziest way he could, that the French civilization would cease to be and would be devoured by foreign neighbors. And he learned from the Romans that if you have this sort of cult of personality, that's one way to establish power. So that's just a little teaser or a taste of how I try to make sure that I am giving the fairest representation of everything I can in the classroom. So that's it for me.
So please feel free to shut me up when I go on too long.
Okay.
No, but I'm going to go on too long. I know. So Ms. VanDamme asked me to speak about how we structure the 3-year curriculum and then the so what of history. So as to the structure of the curriculum, a few things have happened in the last 10,000 years. More than 7. So obviously we have to find some way to break that down. And I'm pretty sure you were the one who came up with the actual division, weren't you, right at the beginning?
The 3-year cycle?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
So in breaking it down the way we do, starting with Ms. VanDamme's idea that history helps us understand where we are now. So working backwards, our end stage of our history curriculum has to be American history. Has to be, we have to know where we are today up to about 1989. So we look at American history, that's the place we're going to end up. But it's impossible to understand American history without understanding where the European colonists came from and why people such as Jefferson and Patrick Henry and George Washington and Ben Franklin believed and acted the way they did in the 18th century to create this unique place, this country of freedom. And that means you need to know something about European history. So if we're going to understand American history, let's take a whole year and talk about that. But we need to set that up first by knowing how the Europeans came to the idea of freedom in 1688, 1689, and why they didn't quite go the whole way with it. But how did they get to the idea of freedom when they started as medieval peasants and serfs at the fall of the Roman Empire? But how did we get to the fall of the Roman Empire? So, with the goal in mind of understanding where we are now, work backwards to find out the breakpoints to help divide the whole 10,000 years of Western civilization up into 3 digestible chunks, if you like. American history, which follows on from European history, which itself follows on from ancient history. So that's where we arrive at the 3-year division, or the 3-period division: ancient, European, and American. Now, well, there's 10,000 years of history, Mr. Lewis. Why not break it up into 10? Well, I'm going to spend a whole year talking about how people learn to farm, and then a whole year just on 20th century history. That's going to be awfully bizarrely weighted if we do that. So we're not going to do it just by number of years. We're looking for the intellectual and comprehensible bits and pieces. And to do it in 3 years, not just spread it out over 10, so that a child who comes in at kindergarten learns about farming and then never hears about it ever again until the end. So the virtue of the 3-year cycle, well, one of the many virtues of it is that a child who's here from kindergarten can go through that process 3 times. Be introduced to the basic facts in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, and all we expect them to know is, oh yeah, there were people who did stuff a long time ago and they had pointy buildings and they wrapped themselves up in cloth. So a very early primitive understanding, but by the time that child comes back to return to that knowledge 3 years later, it isn't boring, it isn't repetitive, because they haven't heard it in 3 years. And they can expand on and build that on their knowledge, and when they hit junior high, they're really going to expand on and deal with much more abstract and intellectual issues, but because we're constantly spiralling through that same year period, they're always enhancing and improving their knowledge. So 3 years, it's a good division of history, and it's also a good educational tool, a good pedagogical tool to help them build up their knowledge always.
How about we take our 2-minute intermission for coffee and then come back to your one.
Okay, and then we get into so what, and I can...
Okay.
So, in teaching history, I always mention, and the practicality of teaching history, there are 6 questions a history student should ask. Who did what? When did they do it? Where did they do it? Why did they do it? And the most important question of all a history student should ask is, so what? Why should we care? Now, are we all aware of the significant historical anniversary this weekend?
Nope.
The 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. We have a holiday off on Monday, people.
And there was never another war after.
The war to end all wars. Okay, so I'm not going to bother explaining the significance of World War I, which was a horrendous event. But one of the reasons that started was because France and Germany had been fighting over the same piece of land since 843, when Charlemagne's son couldn't keep the empire together between Charlemagne's 3 grandsons. So the geopolitical decision made 1,200 years ago contributed to a conflict later on. Now, that's a pretty extreme case. There are much more important ones. If I'm going to tell people about the civil war between Stephen and Matilda in 12th century England, why on earth does that matter? Why should we know about that? Well, because it's the war that brought Henry II to the throne, and he's the one who introduced the idea of grand juries, habeas corpus, and brought all the legal reforms that we take for granted on Law and Order every night on the TV. He's the one who started those things. So there always has to be a recognisable value or an implication of a historical fact for it to be worth us presenting to the students, and they should be able to walk away not necessarily remembering it, but knowing that there was a reason to know that.
Can I add one quick thing in there? I just want to clarify that the reason you want to know the origins of these ideas is not simply because they're the origins. It's not sort of gathering trivia about the origins. No. It's because those things arose as an answer to a problem, to a very serious problem. And learning them as an answer to a problem allows you to understand the value and significance of them today. So it's not just understanding, well, don't forget, somebody had to come up with this and here's the person who did, but learning the historical context of the time and the social and political challenges that they had and the ways that those things are addressed. So I just wanted to make sure that's understood.
Sorry if I didn't make that clear, but that's enough for me.
Thank you.
Mr. Egan.
So Ms. VanDamme asked me to speak about how to teach history to little people, because that's pretty much what I do. So I think the way that I want to start off is just by identifying what's different about little people. And in some ways, they're much more like us than one might think. They're really sharp, really scrutinizing. They ask penetrating questions. They can detect very quickly if you're trying to pull one over on them. So they're much more like us adults than one might think. They're also much different than us than one might think. And the way in which they're different is our range of experiences is exponentially larger than theirs. And so their experiences, their context about anything, any concept, any idea, is radically smaller than ours. And so, just the kind of example I start the school year, just having to kind of go through with the second graders just what wasn't around in history that is around today. And, it's kind of a joke, I didn't actually say this, but something to the effect of, like, these gas stations down in the corner where you can just go and fill up gas in your car and drive anywhere you want to go, get convenient items from the store. They didn't have stuff like that back then. And then they might say something like, okay, but did they have grocery stores back then? Well, no, they didn't have grocery stores either. Okay, well, what about bookstores? So I can't just say, well, all of these technologies they didn't have. They think on a very sort of concrete and immediate level. And so with that in mind, I have basically two principles that I use to teach history to my second and third grade students. So the first principle I would say is students at that level are much more likely to be engaged by what I have to say and to enjoy and understand what I have to say if it's fairly concrete as opposed to abstract. So the more abstract it gets, the less willing they are to tolerate it, and the less interesting it is to them. So the more sort of tangible I can make it, the better. And then the other principle is the more human-centric it is, the more they're going to enjoy it. And maybe that's not even the best term. I think people-centric. The more that I'm able to tell stories about people and the experiences of particular people, the better. And so, since we're talking about teaching, in the spirit of teaching, I brought a whiteboard. So I just want to do a little diagram here. And so they're here at this dot. And so if we kind of go up on this axis, the farther up we go on this axis, the more abstract the material would be. And then the farther out we go on this axis, the less person-centric the material would be. So my job is to teach them here, and to teach material sort of on the fringes of those two factors, basically. And over the course of the year, to slowly stretch them outward, to stretch them up into more abstract ideas and to less person-centric ideas. And so ideally, I'm getting them ready for sort of a mid-level abstraction